Oh my God, no, I hope that's not Lisa.
It's still a very sad case. We have a young woman here who lost her life. She was robbed of her future by someone. We're hoping that this brings a small bit of comfort to her family members.
A young mother walks away from her boyfriend's car in the early morning darkness of a Wisconsin summer night and vanishes within hours. For 34 years, the DNA of her killer sits in an evidence locker, waiting for technology to catch up with justice. When detectives finally crack the case, the resolution reveals a predator who had been hiding in plain sight all along. August 12, 1986, Green Bay, Wisconsin. 22-year-old Lisa Holstead never makes it home from a late-night argument with her boyfriend. Construction workers discover her body that same afternoon in a marshy wetland area. Police collect DNA evidence from the crime scene, critical evidence that points to a killer they cannot identify. Years turn into decades. The case becomes Green Bay's oldest unsolved murder. Lisa's mother passes away without ever learning who took her daughter's life. Her son grows up without answers, without closure, without justice. But in 2019, a dedicated detective decides to take one more look at the evidence using a revolutionary new tool in law enforcement: forensic genetic genealogy. What he uncovers sends shockwaves through the community. The killer had been living among them for over 3 decades. He had a history of violence. He lived mere miles from where Lisa died, and he never thought anyone would find him. Lisa Marie Holstead enters the world in Green Bay, Wisconsin, bringing joy to her parents and siblings. She grows up as a vibrant presence in her family, someone who fills rooms with laughter and music. Lisa possesses a natural gift for singing. Her voice carries through the house during impromptu performances that her family will treasure for years to come. Those who know her describe a young woman with infectious energy and genuine warmth toward others. She makes friends easily and maintains those connections with care and loyalty. By her early 20s, Lisa embraces the role that matters most to her: motherhood. Her son Jeremy arrives when Lisa is just 17 years old. Despite the challenges of young parenthood, she dedicates herself completely to raising him. She works to provide for her small family while maintaining the close bonds with her own parents and siblings. Her brother Stephen remains particularly close to her throughout her life. Her mother becomes her anchor, offering support as Lisa navigates the complexities of being a single mother in her early 20s. Lisa lives in Green Bay, sharing a home with her boyfriend, John Sott. The relationship proves tumultuous at times, marked by disagreements that occasionally escalate into arguments. Still, Lisa maintains her focus on creating stability for her 5-year-old son. She balances work, parenting, and her personal life while staying connected to the family support system that means everything to her. On weekends, she often visits her parents, bringing Jeremy along so they can spend time together as an extended family. Her voice, that beautiful singing voice her family loves, becomes one of the few recordings they will have to remember her by. Lisa sings often, capturing moments of joy in audio recordings that her family carefully preserves. She never suspects these recordings will become irreplaceable treasures. She never imagines her family will cling to these fragments of sound, desperate to hear her voice again. The summer of 1986 unfolds like any other for Lisa Holstead. She goes to work, cares for her son, and navigates the ups and downs of her relationship with John. August arrives with warm nights and the kind of Midwest humidity that makes people restless. Lisa has no reason to believe this August will be different from any other. She has no warning that her life is about to be cut devastatingly short. On the night of August 11th, 1986, Lisa Holstead climbs into a car with her boyfriend John Sott for what should be an uneventful evening. Neither of them knows this will be the last night of Lisa's life. The early morning hours of August 12th, 1986 start with tension. Lisa Holstead and her boyfriend John Sott find themselves in the middle of another argument. The specifics of their disagreement fade into insignificance compared to what happens next. What matters is that around 2:30 in the morning, their dispute reaches a breaking point. John drives through the quiet streets of Green Bay with Lisa in the passenger seat. Their voices rise and fall as they argue. The car eventually stops at the intersection of West Mason Street and Taylor Street, a location that will become burned into the memory of everyone who works this case. Lisa makes a decision in that moment. She opens the car door, steps out onto the pavement, and walks away from the vehicle. John watches her go. He later tells investigators that Lisa simply opens the door, gets out, and walks off into the darkness. He claims he doesn't follow her, he doesn't try to stop her, he just lets her disappear into the night. It's approximately 2:30 a.m. when Lisa Holstead walks away from that car. Witnesses in the area confirm seeing a woman matching Lisa's description moving through the neighborhood around this time. She walks alone through streets that should feel safe in a city where violent crime remains relatively rare. What happens next remains unclear for decades. Lisa encounters someone in those dark, early morning hours. Someone who sees an opportunity. Someone who makes a choice that destroys multiple lives in a single act of violence. The timeline between 2:30 a.m. and when Lisa's body is discovered spans just over 12 hours. 12 hours that transform a missing person situation into a homicide investigation. August 12, 1986, dawns warm and humid. Construction workers report to their job site near what will later be known as the Euers nature area on Green Bay's west side. The location sits in a marshy section of land near Pete's Lake and Duck Creek, where wetlands create natural privacy from the surrounding neighborhood. The workers begin their day with no expectation of the horror they're about to discover. Around early afternoon, one of the construction workers notices something odd in the marshy water. It looks like a hand extending up from the murky surface. The worker moves closer, thinking perhaps someone needs help. As he approaches, the full scope of the scene becomes clear. A woman's body lies partially submerged in the shallow water at the marsh's edge. She's partially clothed, positioned in a way that immediately suggests foul play. The construction workers immediately call 911. Within minutes, police cruisers and emergency vehicles converge on the nature area. Officers secure the scene, knowing they're looking at a homicide. The victim appears young, and the circumstances of her death point to violence. Crime scene investigators arrive and begin the meticulous process of documenting everything before the body can be moved or examined. Before we continue with what investigators found at that scene, hit that subscribe button if you want to see justice served in cases like this. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? The marshland presents challenges for evidence collection. Water can destroy or contaminate crucial forensic material, but the investigators work carefully, photographing the scene from multiple angles and collecting every piece of potential evidence they can find. They note the victim's position, her state of dress, and the immediate surroundings. The location itself provides important information. This area sits relatively isolated, accessible, but not heavily trafficked. Someone chose this spot deliberately. Medical examiners arrive to make their preliminary assessment before the body can be transported for autopsy. Even at the scene, certain facts become apparent. The victim suffered violence before death. Evidence of sexual assault exists. The cause of death appears to be strangulation. The condition of the body suggests she hasn't been deceased for very long, likely less than 12 hours. Identification comes relatively quickly. The victim is Lisa Marie Holstead, the 22-year-old mother whose boyfriend reported her walking away from his car just hours earlier. The timeline starts to form. Lisa walks away from John's car around 2:30 a.m. Her body is discovered around 1:30 p.m. The same day, she dies sometime in that window, likely in the early morning hours. News spreads through Green Bay's tight-knit community. Lisa's family receives the devastating notification. Her parents struggle to comprehend how their daughter went from an argument with her boyfriend to dead in a marsh within hours. Her son Jeremy, only 5 years old, is far too young to understand that his mother won't be coming home ever again. Lisa's brother Stephen and other family members gather in shock and grief, demanding answers about what happened and who did this to someone they loved. The Green Bay Police Department launches a full-scale Homicide investigation. Detectives canvass the neighborhood around Mason and Taylor Streets, looking for anyone who might have seen Lisa during those crucial hours after she left John's car. They interview residents, check for security cameras, and reconstruct Lisa's possible path from where she was last seen to where her body was found. The distance between the two locations, several miles, raises questions about how she traveled and who she encountered. John Sott immediately becomes a person of interest. As the last known person to see Lisa alive, he faces intense scrutiny from investigators. Detectives bring him in for extensive questioning. He maintains his story. They argued Lisa got out of the car at Mason and Taylor, and he watched her walk away. He claims he went home after that and has no idea what happened to her. His timeline checks out with witness accounts of seeing a woman matching Lisa's description in that area. But being the boyfriend automatically places him under suspicion in cases like these. Detectives administer a polygraph test to John. He passes. His alibi holds up under investigation. There's no physical evidence linking him to the crime scene where Lisa's body was found. While the circumstances of their argument and his decision to let her walk away in the middle of the night raise questions about judgment, nothing points to him as the killer. Investigators reluctantly begin looking elsewhere. The medical examiner's full autopsy report confirms the preliminary findings. Lisa Holstead died from strangulation. She was sexually assaulted before or around the time of death. The examiner estimates time of death in the early morning hours of August 12th, consistent with the timeline of when she disappeared. Most critically, the examiner's team collects biological evidence from Lisa's body. DNA samples exist. Material that can potentially identify her killer gets carefully preserved and sent to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab for analysis. What investigators found in those samples would eventually crack this case wide open, but not for another 34 years. The Green Bay Police Department throws everything they have at the Lisa Holstead murder investigation. Lead detectives organize a command center and begin the systematic process of tracking down every lead, interviewing every witness, and analyzing every piece of evidence collected from the crime scene. The department understands the urgency. A young mother has been killed violently, and the perpetrator likely still walks the streets of their community. Detectives focus heavily on the timeline and geography. Lisa walks away from John's car at Mason and Taylor around 2:30 a.m. Her body turns up miles away in a marshy nature area. How does she get from point A to point B? Does she know her killer? Does someone offer her a ride? Does she encounter a stranger who sees an opportunity? These questions drive the early investigation. Canvas teams spread throughout the neighborhoods between where Lisa was last seen and where her body was discovered. They knock on doors at all hours, hoping to find someone who saw something, heard something, or noticed anything unusual in those early morning hours. A few witnesses come forward confirming they saw a woman matching Lisa's description walking alone around 2:30 to 3 a.m. But no one reports seeing her get into a vehicle or interact with anyone else. She simply walks through the darkness and then vanishes from view. The crime scene itself yields crucial evidence. Investigators collect DNA samples from Lisa's body, biological material left behind by her attacker. This evidence gets rushed to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab for processing. In 1986, DNA technology is still in its relative infancy for law enforcement purposes. The ability to create DNA profiles and match them exists, but the databases and sophisticated techniques that will emerge in later years haven't been developed yet. Still, the evidence gets carefully preserved with the hope that it will eventually lead to identification. Crime lab technicians work to develop a DNA profile from the biological samples. They succeed in extracting usable genetic material. The profile gets entered into the available databases, but it doesn't match any known offenders. The DNA sits in the system, waiting for a match that doesn't come. Detectives check and recheck, hoping for a hit that would give them a suspect's name. Nothing appears. Investigators turn their attention to Lisa's personal life. looking for anyone who might have wanted to harm her. They interview her family members, friends, co-workers, and acquaintances. They map out her social connections and daily routines. They examine her relationship with John Sott more deeply, despite his past polygraph. The detective team looks at other men Lisa may have dated or interacted with. They investigate whether she had any enemies, anyone who threatened her, or any recent conflicts with people in her life. The examination of Lisa's last known movements reveals she lived a relatively routine life centered around work and her son. She didn't frequent bars or engage in high-risk behaviors. She maintained steady employment and close family ties. Nothing in her background suggests she would have crossed paths with dangerous individuals. Yet someone found her that night and made a calculated decision to assault and murder her. Detectives expand their search to include sex offenders in the area. They pull records of anyone with convictions for sexual assault or violence against women in Brown County and surrounding regions. They begin the tedious process of tracking down these individuals, verifying their whereabouts on the night of August 12th, and looking for any connection to Lisa or the crime scene. Some refuse to cooperate and require warrants. Others provide alibis that check out. The list of potential suspects grows and then shrinks as each person gets cleared through. Investigation. The Green Bay Police Department releases information to the media, hoping public attention might generate tips. Local news outlets cover the murder extensively. Lisa's photo appears in newspapers and on television broadcasts. The department establishes a tip line and encourages anyone with information to come forward. The community responds with concern and some tips, but nothing leads to a breakthrough. No one reports seeing anything that moves the investigation forward. Forensic evidence from the scene gets analyzed in detail. Investigators look at tire tracks, footprints, and any physical trace evidence collected from the marshy area. They examine Lisa's clothing and personal belongings for clues about her killer. The sexual assault component means they pay particular attention to any evidence that might identify the perpetrator. But in 1986, the limitations of forensic science mean some evidence can't be fully analyzed or interpreted. Detectives preserve everything, hoping future technology might reveal answers. As weeks turn into months, the investigation begins to lose momentum. Detectives have exhausted the obvious leads. They've interviewed hundreds of people. They've checked and rechecked alibis. The DNA evidence sits in the database with no matches. Tips from the public slow to a trickle and then stop almost entirely. The case doesn't go cold immediately, but the active daily investigation work gradually decreases as other pressing cases demand attention. Lisa's family refuses to let her memory fade. Her mother writes letters to newspapers and police, pleading for answers. One letter, written just 2 months after the murder, addresses the killer directly. How can you continue to live life every day knowing what you've done? Apparently, you have no conscience. The letter captures the family's anguish and frustration. Lisa's mother desperately wants to know who took her daughter's life and why. She wants justice for Lisa and peace for her family. The investigation remains officially open, but progress stalls. Detectives periodically review the case file, looking for something they might have missed. They follow up on occasional tips that come in. They recheck the DNA database whenever it gets updated with new profiles. But year after year, no breakthrough emerges. The case gets passed from one detective to another as retirements and reassignments shift personnel. Each new detective assigned to the case reviews the file, hopes to find the missing piece, and eventually has to accept that the answers remain elusive. Lisa's son Jeremy grows up without his mother. He turns 6, then 10, then 15, with the question of who killed Lisa hanging over his childhood and adolescence. The family marks birthdays and holidays with her absence felt acutely. They gather at her grave on the anniversary of her death each year, hoping that someday they'll have answers to bring when they visit. The case officially becomes Green Bay's oldest unsolved murder. The designation feels like a badge of failure to the investigators who worked the case. They know the DNA evidence exists. They know the killer's genetic profile sits in their files. But without a match in the database and without new leads, they can do nothing except wait and hope. Advances in DNA technology emerged through the 1990s and 2000s. The Wisconsin State Crime Lab periodically retests the evidence using newer, more sensitive techniques. Each time, they confirm the DNA profile and check it against expanded databases. Each time, no match appears. The killer remains unidentified. Detectives begin to wonder if he died before DNA databases became standard, or if he simply never committed another crime that would have required him to submit a DNA sample. Lisa's mother passes away without ever learning who murdered her daughter. The loss compounds the family's grief. The person Lisa's mother appealed to in that letter, the killer with no conscience, outlives his victim's mother. Jeremy grows into adulthood, carrying the weight of unanswered questions about his mother's death. He becomes a father himself, knowing his children will never meet their grandmother and that the person who took her from them walks free. By the late 2010s, the case sits in the cold case files, reviewed occasionally, but with little hope of resolution. The evidence remains preserved. The DNA profile stays in the system. But after more than 30 years, the likelihood of a breakthrough seems minimal. Detectives who worked the case in 1986 have retired or passed away. The institutional memory of the investigation exists primarily in file boxes and digital records. Then, everything changes. Advances in a relatively new field called forensic genetic genealogy begin solving cold cases that seemed hopeless. The Golden State Killer case in California captures national attention when investigators use public DNA databases and family tree construction to identify a suspect after decades. Law enforcement agencies across the country start exploring whether this technique could work for their unsolved cases. And that's where the case hit a wall that would last for 34 years, until one dedicated detective decided to try something revolutionary. 3 decades pass with Lisa Holstead's murder file sitting in the cold case archives. The physical evidence remains carefully preserved in the evidence locker. The DNA profile gets checked against databases religiously whenever updates occur. The case file itself grows thick with reports, interviews, and dead-end leads. But nothing moves the needle toward identifying Lisa's killer. Throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, various detectives pick up the case, hoping fresh eyes might spot something previous investigators missed. Each one reviews the original crime scene photos, reads through witness statements, and studies the timeline of Lisa's last hours. Each detective develops theories about what might have happened and who could be responsible. But theories without evidence lead nowhere. The DNA evidence represents both hope and frustration. Investigators know they have the killer's genetic fingerprint. If that person ever gets arrested for another crime and submits DNA as part of the booking process, the database will flag a match immediately. But as years pass without that match occurring, detectives begin to consider other possibilities. Maybe the killer died before DNA collection became standard practice. Maybe he moved out of the country. Maybe he simply stopped committing crimes that would require DNA submission. Periodically, tips come into the Green Bay Police Department about the Holstead case. Someone claims to have information about what happened that night. Someone else suggests a suspect who seemed suspicious at the time. Detectives follow up on every credible tip, no matter how many years have passed. They track down the people mentioned in tips, verify their whereabouts in August 1986, and compare any available DNA samples to the evidence from the crime scene. None of these tips pan out. The Holstead family never stops advocating for Lisa. Her brother Stephen becomes a vocal presence, regularly contacting police for updates and speaking to media when opportunities arise. Jeremy, Lisa's son, grows from a confused 5-year-old into a man who barely remembers his mother, but feels the weight of her absence every day. The family refuses to let Lisa become just another statistic, another cold case that fades from public consciousness. In the early 2000s, advances in DNA testing technology offer new possibilities. The Wisconsin State Crime Lab retests the biological evidence using more sophisticated techniques that can extract information from smaller or degraded samples. The retesting confirms and refines the DNA profile, making it more detailed and potentially more useful for comparison. But the enhanced profile still doesn't match anyone in the available databases. Detective after detective cycles through the case over the years. Some spend months immersed in every detail, convinced they'll be the one to crack it. Others give it periodic attention between other active investigations. The Green Bay Police Department never officially closes the case, maintaining it as an active investigation, even when no actual investigative work is happening. Department leadership understands the importance of cold cases like this one, not just for the victim's family, but for the community's sense of safety and justice. The development of CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, brings renewed hope. When CODIS comes online and begins connecting DNA evidence across jurisdictions, investigators submit Lisa's case evidence for comparison against the growing database. The system checks millions of profiles collected from crime scenes and convicted offenders across the United States. Detectives wait anxiously for notification of a match. The notification never comes. Around 2010, the case receives renewed media attention when a local news outlet does a feature on Green Bay's oldest unsolved cases. Lisa's story gets retold for a new generation of viewers. The segment includes interviews with family members and appeals for anyone with information to come forward. The coverage generates some tips, but like all previous tips, they lead nowhere concrete. Detectives investigate multiple suspects over the years who seem promising initially, but ultimately get cleared. One man with a history of violence against women lives in the area in 1986 and has no solid alibi for that night. Investigators spend months building a case against him, only to have his DNA come back as not a match to the crime scene evidence. Another suspect emerges when someone claims an acquaintance confessed to killing a woman in Green Bay in the 1980s. That lead consumes investigative resources for weeks before the confession is revealed as false. The person confessing wasn't even in Wisconsin at the time. People like Lisa's killer count on silence to cover their evil. Show them your voice stands for justice. Type "Justice for Lisa Holstead" in the comments and hit that like button. The psychological toll on the investigators assigned to cold cases like Lisa's can be profound. Detectives develop a personal connection to the victim through studying their life, their final hours, and the devastation left behind. Many investigators on the Holstead case over the years speak about feeling like they've failed Lisa and her family. The DNA evidence sitting useless in a database feels like a taunt. They know who did it on a molecular level, but can't put a name or face to those molecules. By 2015, the case file bears the marks of 3 decades of investigation. Multiple generations of detectives have added their reports and findings. The original paper files have been scanned and digitized. The evidence has been tested and retested with increasingly sophisticated technology. And still, Lisa Holstead's killer remains unidentified. The emergence of consumer genetic testing services like 23andMe and Ancestry.com in the mid-2010s introduces a cultural shift in how people think about DNA. Millions of people voluntarily submit their genetic information to learn about their heritage and connect with relatives. These databases grow exponentially, containing genetic information from people who have never been convicted of crimes and would never appear in law enforcement databases. At first, law enforcement doesn't fully understand the potential of this new resource. Then, in April 2018, everything changes in the world of cold case investigation. California investigators announce they've identified the Golden State Killer, a serial rapist and murderer who terrorized California in the 1970s and 1980s, using a technique called forensic genetic genealogy. Instead of waiting for a direct DNA match in law enforcement databases, investigators uploaded the crime scene DNA profile to a public genetic genealogy website. The profile matched distant relatives of the perpetrator. Genealogists then built family trees and used traditional detective work to narrow down suspects until they identified Joseph DeAngelo. The Golden State Killer breakthrough sends ripples through law enforcement nationwide. cold case detectives everywhere start asking, could this technique work for our cases? Could we finally solve murders and rapes that have haunted our communities for decades? Police departments and crime labs begin exploring partnerships with genealogy experts and companies that specialize in forensic genetic genealogy. In Wisconsin, the technique makes headlines when investigators use it to identify Ray Van Nieuwenhoven as the suspect in a 1976 double murder in Marinette County. The case had been cold for 43 years. Forensic genetic genealogy cracks it in months. Law enforcement agencies across Wisconsin take notice, including the Green Bay Police Department. Around 2019, Detective David Graff asks to take on the Lisa Holstead case. Graff has been aware of the case throughout his career with the department. Like many Green Bay officers, he knows it as the city's oldest unsolved murder, a source of frustration and determination in equal measure. Graff sees the news about genetic genealogy solving other cold cases and recognizes an opportunity. The Holstead case has excellent DNA evidence, carefully preserved for over 30 years. Maybe this new technique can finally give Lisa's family the answers they've waited decades to receive. Graff begins researching forensic genetic genealogy extensively. He reaches out to other Wisconsin agencies that have used the technique successfully. He contacts investigators in California who pioneered the method. He learns about the complex process of uploading DNA profiles to genealogy databases, interpreting the results, building family trees, and narrowing down suspects through traditional detective work. The technique isn't simple, but it offers something the traditional approach couldn't: a way to identify suspects who have never been arrested and whose DNA has never been collected by law enforcement. The process requires patience and specialized expertise. Graff connects with labs and genealogists who can assist with the technical aspects. He prepares the Holstead case evidence for genetic genealogy analysis, ensuring the DNA profile meets the requirements for upload to public databases. He briefs his superiors on the plan and gets department support for pursuing this avenue of investigation. But in late 2019, Detective Graff makes the decision to give Lisa Holstead's case one more chance, using cutting-edge science that didn't exist when she was murdered. A decision that would finally, after 34 years, bring her killer's name to light. Detective David Graff submits Lisa Holstead's crime scene DNA profile to a laboratory specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. The lab processes the decades-old sample using techniques designed to extract maximum information from the genetic material. The technicians work carefully, knowing this evidence represents the best chance at solving a murder that has haunted Green Bay for over 3 decades. The lab successfully develops a comprehensive DNA profile suitable for genealogical comparison. They upload this profile to GED Match, one of the public databases where people voluntarily share their genetic information to find relatives and explore their ancestry. The system begins searching for matches, not looking for an exact match to the killer, but rather matches to people who share significant amounts of DNA with him. These would be his relatives, siblings, cousins, possibly even children or parents. The search returns results. Multiple people in the database share enough DNA with the unknown subject to suggest family connections. None of these people are the killer themselves, but their genetic information provides roadmap markers pointing toward his identity. The lab analyzes the strength of these connections, determining how closely related each match is to the person who left DNA at Lisa's crime scene. Graff now faces the complex work of genetic genealogy investigation. Working with genealogists, he begins building family trees based on the DNA matches. Each match represents a branch of a larger family structure. By constructing these trees upward through parents and grandparents, then downward through their descendants, the genealogist can identify common ancestors shared between multiple matches. Somewhere in those family trees, the killer exists as a descendant of those common ancestors. The process takes months of painstaking work. Genealogists scour public records, census data, birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries, and any other available documentation to map out family connections. They build trees containing hundreds of people across multiple generations. They look for patterns in where family members lived, their ages, and their movements over time. The killer had to be in the Green Bay area in August 1986, so anyone who can be placed elsewhere during that time gets eliminated. The investigation narrows down to 10 to 15 people who fit the preliminary profile based on the genetic genealogy work. These individuals all descend from the common ancestors identified through the DNA matches. They're all male and of an age that would be consistent with committing the crime in 1986. Most crucially, several of these people have connections to Wisconsin, specifically to the Green Bay area. Graff and his team begin the traditional detective work of investigating these potential suspects. They research backgrounds, verify locations in 1986, and look for any history of violence or criminal behavior. This phase represents the critical bridge between genetic science and law enforcement investigation. The DNA points to families. The detective work identifies the specific individual within those families. One name emerges as particularly compelling: Lou Archie Griffin. In 1986, Griffin lives in Green Bay. His age fits the profile, and most significantly, he has a documented history of violence against women. In 1981, Griffin is convicted of second-degree sexual assault of a child. He receives a 9-year prison sentence. Records show he gets released on parole in May 1986, just 3 months before Lisa Holstead is murdered. Graff digs deeper into Griffin's background. In July 1986, Griffin's parole gets transferred to a Green Bay unit. He lives within a few miles of where Lisa was last seen alive at Mason and Taylor Streets. His regular route to and from work takes him past the marshy area where Lisa's body was found, and his pattern of offending involves sexual violence and strangulation, the same elements present in Lisa's murder. Before we get to the arrest that shocked everyone, share this video with someone who follows true crime. Stories like Lisa's need to be heard. Also, drop a comment. What's the weather like where you are? But Griffin never appeared in the original investigation. His DNA isn't in CODIS because his conviction predates the era of mandatory DNA collection for felons in Wisconsin. He simply isn't on law enforcement's radar as a potential suspect. Without the genetic genealogy work leading investigators to his family tree, Griffin might never have been connected to Lisa's murder. Graff knows he has a promising suspect, but he needs confirmation. He can't simply arrest Griffin based on genetic genealogy findings alone. He needs to collect Griffin's DNA and compare it directly to the crime scene evidence. But Griffin no longer lives in Green Bay. At some point after the murder, he relocates to Racine, Wisconsin, about 100 miles south. The Green Bay Police Department coordinates with the Racine County Sheriff's Department to establish surveillance on Griffin. They need to collect a DNA sample without alerting him to the investigation. The technique chosen is one that has become standard in cold case investigations: trash collection. If Griffin discards any items that might contain his DNA, cigarette butts, beverage containers, eating utensils, investigators can legally collect those items from the trash and test them. In the fall of 2020, surveillance teams watch Griffin's Racine residence. They observe his daily patterns, waiting for opportunities to collect discarded items. The surveillance pays off. Griffin throws away beer cans and cigarette butts. Investigators collect these items carefully, maintaining chain of custody to ensure the evidence will hold up in court. The collected items go to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab for DNA testing. Technicians extract DNA from the beer cans and cigarette butts, develop a profile from Griffin's genetic material, and compare it to the DNA profile from Lisa Holstead's crime scene. The comparison runs through the lab's analysis protocols. The results come back. A match. Lou Archie Griffin's DNA matches the DNA recovered from Lisa Holstead's body in 1986. After 34 years, investigators finally have a name to attach to the evidence that has sat in their files for over 3 decades. Graff briefs his superiors on the findings. The Green Bay Police Department coordinates with the FBI, the Wisconsin Department of Justice Division of Criminal Investigation, and Racine County authorities to plan Griffin's arrest. They prepare a comprehensive case file documenting how the genetic genealogy investigation led them to Griffin, and how the DNA match confirms his involvement in Lisa's murder. On the morning of October 28, 2020, a multi-agency team arrives at Lou Archie Griffin's Racine home at approximately 6:02 a.m. Officers knock on the door. Griffin, now 65 years old, answers. The officers identify themselves and inform him he's under arrest for the 1986 murder of Lisa Holstead in Green Bay. 34 years after he killed a young mother and left her body in a marsh, Lou Griffin faces law enforcement's justice. Griffin doesn't resist arrest. Officers take him into custody and transport him back to Brown County. The man who thought he'd gotten away with murder for over 3 decades now sits in an interrogation room, facing detectives who have waited years to ask him questions about that August night in 1986. When detectives brought Griffin in for questioning, what they heard revealed a predator who never expected science would betray him 3 decades after his crime. Lou Griffin sits across from Green Bay police detectives in the interrogation room. At 65 years old, he spent the majority of his adult life believing he escaped consequences for what he did to Lisa Holstead. The detectives understand they're dealing with someone who has maintained silence about this crime for 34 years. Breaking through that silence requires strategy and patience. The interrogation begins with detectives establishing the timeline. They ask Griffin about his whereabouts and activities in August 1986. Griffin initially appears cooperative but vague. He claims he doesn't remember much about that specific time period. It was over 3 decades ago, he reasons. How can anyone remember specific days from that far back? Detectives shift their approach. They ask Griffin if he knows who Lisa Holstead is. Griffin denies recognizing the name. He claims he never met her, never saw her, never had any interaction with her whatsoever. He maintains this position firmly, stating unequivocally that he has no connection to Lisa or her death. The detectives let Griffin continue with his denials. They take notes, allowing him to commit to his story. In interrogations like this, investigators often let suspects dig themselves into false narratives before presenting the evidence that contradicts those narratives. The more firmly a suspect denies something that evidence proves true, the harder it becomes for them to maintain credibility when that evidence emerges. Graff and his colleagues have prepared extensively for this interrogation. They know Griffin's criminal history. They know about his 1981 conviction for second-degree sexual assault of a child. They know he was released from prison just months before Lisa's murder. They know his pattern of offending involves violence and sexual assault. And most importantly, they know his DNA matches the evidence from Lisa's body. After allowing Griffin to maintain his denials for some time, detectives begin introducing elements of the evidence. They inform him that DNA was collected from Lisa Holstead's crime scene in 1986. They explain that this DNA has been preserved and tested multiple times over the years. They tell him that advances in science have made it possible to identify people from DNA evidence even when those people aren't in criminal databases. Griffin's demeanor shifts slightly. The mention of DNA clearly concerns him, though he tries to maintain his composed exterior. He continues insisting he never met Lisa and knows nothing about her death. The detectives reveal more. They explain the forensic genetic genealogy process, how investigators used public DNA databases to build family trees leading to suspects. They describe how this technique led them to investigate Griffin specifically. They detail the surveillance conducted in Racine and the collection of his discarded beer cans and cigarette butts. Then comes the crucial moment. Detectives inform Griffin that DNA extracted from those items was compared to the DNA from Lisa Holstead's crime scene. The results show a match. His genetic material matches the biological evidence recovered from Lisa's body 34 years ago. Faced with incontrovertible scientific evidence, Griffin's story changes dramatically. He no longer denies knowing Lisa. Instead, he shifts to a new narrative. He tells detectives that he might have had sex with Lisa Holstead. He acknowledges that the DNA evidence proves sexual contact occurred between them. but he adamantly denies killing her. Griffin claims he doesn't remember the encounter clearly. He states he was high on cocaine and heavily intoxicated on alcohol around that time period. His memory of August 1986 remains fuzzy due to his substance abuse. He suggests that perhaps he and Lisa had consensual sex, but he has no recollection of the specific circumstances or details. Detectives push back against this explanation. They point out the medical examiner's findings. Lisa was sexually assaulted and strangled to death. The DNA evidence places Griffin at the scene of a murder, not a consensual encounter. They note that Lisa's body was found in a secluded marsh, partially clothed, showing clear signs of violence. The forensic evidence indicates she fought for her life. Griffin continues to deny the murder itself. He admits the sexual contact but maintains he didn't kill her. He can't explain how his DNA ended up on a murder victim if he wasn't involved in her death. He offers no alternative explanation for what happened or how Lisa ended up dead after their encounter. The detectives present additional evidence that undermines Griffin's revised story. They inform him about his criminal history, specifically his pattern of violence against women and his use of strangulation as a method in previous assaults. They note that he was released from prison for a sexual assault conviction just 3 months before Lisa was murdered. They point out that he lived within miles of where she was last seen and where her body was found. Detectives also confront Griffin with the geographic and timeline evidence. They establish that he regularly drove past the area where Lisa's body was discovered on his way to and from work. They note that he had opportunity, means, and a history consistent with this type of violent crime. The circumstantial evidence, combined with the DNA match, paints a damning picture. Throughout the interrogation, Griffin never provides a full confession to murder. He acknowledges the sexual contact proven by DNA, but refuses to admit he killed Lisa. He remains cooperative in his demeanor. He voluntarily came to the sheriff's office to speak with investigators and doesn't demand a lawyer during the initial questioning, but he maintains a line he won't cross. He'll admit to what the evidence proves conclusively, but nothing more. Detectives note patterns in Griffin's responses that suggest consciousness of guilt. His initial complete denial of knowing Lisa, followed by admission of sexual contact only after DNA evidence is presented, demonstrates awareness that the truth incriminates him. His claim of not remembering due to drugs and alcohol provides a convenient excuse for not having to provide details that could be contradicted by evidence. The interrogation reveals Griffin as someone who thought he'd successfully escaped justice. For 34 years, he lived his life knowing he killed Lisa Holstead, but believing law enforcement would never connect him to the crime. He never imagined that DNA evidence collected in 1986 would eventually be analyzed using genealogy techniques that didn't exist when he committed the murder. Graff asks Griffin if he has anything to say to Lisa's family, her son who grew up without a mother, her parents who died without answers, her siblings who have grieved for over 3 decades. Griffin offers no statement of remorse or apology. He provides no closure beyond what the DNA evidence already proved. The interrogation concludes with Griffin in custody, facing charges for a murder he thought he'd buried in the past, along with his victim. His partial admissions, combined with the overwhelming DNA evidence and circumstantial factors, provide prosecutors with a strong case. With a confession on tape, albeit a limited one, that admits only to the sexual contact proven by DNA, prosecutors moved quickly to ensure Griffin would face justice for what he did to Lisa Holstead. The Brown County District Attorney's Office files charges against Lou Archie Griffin on October 29, 2020, just 1 day after his arrest. The charge is first-degree intentional homicide in the death of Lisa Holstead. This represents the most serious homicide charge available under Wisconsin law, carrying a mandatory life sentence upon conviction. The swift filing of charges reflects the strength of the evidence against Griffin, particularly the DNA match that definitively places him at the crime scene. Griffin appears in court for his initial hearing. The judge sets bail at $1 million cash, an amount that ensures Griffin remains in custody throughout the legal proceedings. At 65 years old and facing life in prison, Griffin presents a significant flight risk. The high bail amount reflects both the severity of the charges and the concern that he might attempt to flee rather than face trial. The case attracts significant media attention. Green Bay's oldest unsolved murder finally has a suspect in custody. Local news outlets cover every court appearance and development. The story of how genetic genealogy solved the case after 34 years captures public interest. The Green Bay Police Department holds press conferences to explain the investigation and the breakthrough that led to Griffin's identification. During a November 2020 press conference, Police Chief Andrew Smith addresses the community and, symbolically, Lisa's family. He reads aloud a letter that Lisa's mother wrote 2 months after the murder. A letter pleading with the killer to come forward, questioning how he could live with his conscience. Lisa's mother passed away years before Griffin's arrest, never learning the identity of her daughter's killer. Chief Smith's reading of her words brings emotional weight to the moment, highlighting the decades of pain endured by Lisa's family. FBI Special Agent Robert Hughes speaks at the conference as well, noting the multi-agency cooperation that made the arrest possible. He expresses regret that Lisa's mother couldn't witness this day, but suggests she would be pleased seeing justice moving forward. The involvement of federal agents, state investigators, and multiple local departments demonstrates the resources dedicated to solving Lisa's murder once the genetic genealogy avenue opened. Lisa's family members, while grateful for the arrest, struggle with complex emotions. Jeremy Holstead, Lisa's son, finally has a name and face attached to the person who killed his mother. But the answers come 34 years too late for him to have grown up with any real memory of her. His grandmother, who helped raise him and who never stopped fighting for justice, didn't live to see this day. The closure feels incomplete. Justice delayed for so long that key family members never witnessed it. Griffin's defense attorneys face a challenging case. The DNA evidence is virtually irrefutable. Griffin's own partial admission during interrogation undermines any claim of complete innocence. His criminal history, including the sexual assault conviction just months before Lisa's murder, provides prosecutors with powerful context about his propensity for violence against women. The defense team must develop a strategy that acknowledges these realities. As the case moves through pretrial proceedings, Griffin's attorneys file various motions. One particularly noteworthy motion seeks permission to present an alternate suspect theory to the jury. Wisconsin law requires defense teams to get court approval before arguing that someone else committed the crime. Griffin's attorneys want to suggest that Lisa's boyfriend John Sott was actually responsible for her death. Judge Timothy Hinkfuss holds a hearing on this motion in September 2022. After reviewing arguments from both sides, the judge rules that the defense can present evidence pointing to Sott as an alternate suspect. This ruling sets up what could be a contentious trial, where the defense attempts to shift blame despite the DNA evidence linking Griffin to the crime scene. The case moves toward trial with jury selection scheduled to begin on January 27, 2023. Prosecutors prepare to present the DNA evidence, the genetic genealogy investigation, and Griffin's statements to detectives. They plan to call expert witnesses to explain the science and establish the reliability of the DNA match. They intend to present Griffin's criminal history to show his pattern of sexual violence. The prosecution feels confident in their case, but knows that trials always carry uncertainty. The defense prepares to argue reasonable doubt, suggesting that while Griffin may have had sexual contact with Lisa, someone else, possibly her boyfriend, actually killed her. This strategy attempts to separate the sexual assault from the murder, acknowledging what the DNA proves while contesting Griffin's responsibility for Lisa's death. On the morning of January 27, 2023, more than 80 potential jurors report to the Brown County Courthouse. The trial is expected to last 2 weeks. Family members gather, preparing to hear testimony about Lisa's final hours and the evidence against her accused killer. Media representatives fill the courtroom, ready to cover every moment of a trial that has been 36 years in the making. But before jury selection even begins, everything changes. Griffin's attorneys approach the prosecution with a proposal. Rather than proceed to trial, Griffin indicates willingness to plead to a lesser charge. The negotiations happen quickly, with both sides recognizing certain realities about the case. Griffin agrees to plead no contest to homicide by reckless conduct instead of first-degree intentional homicide. A no contest plea means Griffin doesn't admit guilt, but acknowledges that sufficient evidence exists for a conviction. The legal effect is the same as a guilty plea for sentencing purposes. The court accepts the plea and finds Griffin guilty of homicide by reckless conduct. This plea deal triggers immediate controversy. First-degree intentional homicide carries a mandatory life sentence. Homicide by reckless conduct, while still a serious felony, allows for a maximum sentence of just 10 years in prison under Wisconsin law as it existed in 1986. And this brings up a critical legal issue that will outrage Lisa's family. Griffin must be sentenced according to the laws in effect at the time he committed the crime. The United States Constitution prohibits ex post facto laws that retroactively increase punishment for crimes committed before the law's enactment. In 1986, when Griffin killed Lisa, homicide by reckless conduct carried a maximum penalty of 10 years. By 2023, the same crime carries a maximum of 40 years. But Griffin cannot be sentenced under the current law. He must be sentenced under 1986 standards. Brown County District Attorney David Lacey acknowledges this reality in public statements. He calls it a compromised outcome, driven by constitutional requirements. The prosecution accepted the plea rather than risk a trial where the alternate suspect theory might create enough reasonable doubt for acquittal. A guaranteed conviction with 10 years seemed preferable to the possibility of no conviction at all. Griffin's sentencing hearing takes place on March 27, 2023. The courtroom fills with Lisa's family members, each preparing to address the court about the impact of her murder on their lives. The emotional weight of 36 years of grief and frustration hangs heavy in the air. Lisa's brother Lisa Holstead speaks first. He thanks the numerous police officers who worked on the case over the decades, acknowledging their dedication and perseverance. Then he turns his attention to Griffin, sitting impassively at the defense table. Stephen's statement carries the accumulated pain of more than 13,000 days since Lisa's death. The pain it caused our family cannot even be described here, Stephen tells the court. Many tears. I have thought about Lisa all these years, every day, and up until the last 2 years, multiple times a day, thinking, what happened to her, and what you did to her. You should be ashamed of yourself, but you know what? You're probably not. Stephen's words cut to the core of the family's anguish. He notes that it has been 13,377 days since Griffin murdered Lisa. 13,377 days that Lisa's family has lived with the absence, the questions, and the pain. He points out that in that time span, people build entire careers, raise families, and live full lives. Lisa never got that chance. She lies in a grave, reduced to bones, while her killer walked free. You stole her from us, Stephen continues. You stole Lisa's life from our family. You're a coward. The court also plays audio recordings of Lisa singing. These precious recordings represent some of the only remaining audio of Lisa's voice. Her family has no video footage of her, making these singing recordings irreplaceable treasures. The sound of Lisa's voice fills the courtroom, a haunting reminder of the vibrant woman whose life was cut short. Jeremy Holstead, Lisa's son, also addresses the court. At 40 years old, he has lived the vast majority of his life without his mother. He states that while he finds some measure of closure in knowing his mother's killer has been identified and convicted, the sentence feels grossly inadequate. His children have grown up without knowing their grandmother. He has raised his family without his mother's presence and guidance. Other family members speak about the lasting trauma of Lisa's unsolved murder. They describe years of wondering, hoping, and grieving without answers. They talk about Lisa's mother's death without ever knowing who killed her daughter. They express frustration that Griffin lived a free life for 34 years while Lisa's family suffered. Griffin's defense attorney offers a brief statement, But Griffin himself says nothing to the court. He offers no apology, no explanation, no expression of remorse. He sits silently as Lisa's family pours out their pain. Judge John Zakowski delivers the sentence: 10 years in prison, the maximum allowable under the 1986 law for homicide by reckless conduct. With time served since his 2020 arrest and potential good behavior credits, Griffin could be released in significantly less than 10 years. For a man who sexually assaulted and murdered a young mother, the sentence feels shockingly lenient. The family's reaction is immediate and vocal. Susan Holstead, Lisa's sister, speaks to media outside the courthouse. For us being in 2023 and having to bounce back to 1986 laws where he's going 10 years, it's revolting. It is disgusting. Jeremy expresses similar outrage. I do have some closure. I'm happy the court process is done, and we do have a name and face for the person who murdered my mother. But this sentencing is done already. Nothing is going to change that. The family channels their frustration into advocacy. They begin pushing for changes to the law that would allow offenders in cold cases to be sentenced under current statutes rather than the laws in effect at the time of the crime. Jeremy and Susan both vow to fight for legislative change to ensure no other family faces the same injustice of seeing their loved one's killer receive a fraction of the sentence that would be imposed today. District Attorney Lacey defends the outcome while acknowledging the family's disappointment. We know who killed Lisa. That person has taken responsibility legally for his actions. He's sentenced for having killed her. He's labelled a murderer. But even Lacey admits the sentence doesn't match the severity of the crime in modern terms. Griffin begins serving his sentence in a Wisconsin state prison. He will be eligible for release on parole well before the 10-year maximum, depending on his behavior while incarcerated. For Lisa's family, the knowledge that her killer could walk free again in a matter of years compounds their frustration with the system. The case does lead to positive developments in how cold cases are investigated. The successful use of forensic genetic genealogy in Lisa's case encourages other Wisconsin law enforcement agencies to explore the technique for their unsolved murders. Detective Graff becomes something of an expert on the methodology, sharing his knowledge with other departments, hoping to solve their own cold cases. Lisa's family works to ensure she's remembered for more than just being a murder victim. They share stories about her singing, her devotion to her son, and her warm personality. They post tributes on social media on the anniversary of her birth and death. They maintain her grave and visit regularly, now able to tell her they know who took her life, even if justice came too late and too leniently. The Green Bay community watches the case's resolution with mixed feelings. Relief that the city's oldest cold case is finally solved mixes with frustration about the sentence. The case sparks conversations about criminal justice reform, particularly regarding how historical crimes should be sentenced when resolved decades later. Griffin's conviction removes him from the list of unsolved murders in Wisconsin, but adds his name to the roster of cases solved through innovative genetic genealogy techniques. The Lisa Holstead case becomes part of training materials for law enforcement agencies, learning about this investigative tool. Her name, which should have been forgotten only by time and happy memories, instead becomes associated with both tragedy and the scientific advances that brought her killer to justice. 37 years after Lisa Holstead walked away from her boyfriend's car into the darkness of an August night, her family finally has answers about what happened and who was responsible. The answers came too late for her mother. The sentence seems inadequate for the crime, but justice, however delayed and diminished, arrived at last. The Lisa Holstead case represents both the triumph and the limitations of cold case investigation. After 34 years, groundbreaking genetic genealogy technology identified her killer and brought him to justice. The science that didn't exist in 1986 finally caught up with Lou Griffin's crime, proving that even decades of silence cannot permanently shield a murderer from accountability. Yet the resolution also exposes gaps in our justice system. Constitutional protections that prevent retroactive punishment, protections that exist for important reasons, created a situation where Griffin receives 10 years for a crime that would mandate life in prison under current law. Lisa's family must grapple with this reality. Justice served is not always justice satisfied. Detective David Graff's decision to pursue genetic genealogy for Lisa's case demonstrates the importance of persistence in cold case investigations. Without his willingness to learn a new investigative technique and apply it to a decades-old murder, Griffin would likely never have been identified. The case proves that evidence carefully preserved and regularly re-examined with new technology can eventually yield answers. Lisa Holstead was 22 years old when her life ended in a marsh on Green Bay's west side. She was a mother, a daughter, a sister, and a friend. She sang with a beautiful voice that her family preserved in precious recordings. She loved her son Jeremy and worked to build a life for them both. Her murder took all of that away and left a wound in her family that time cannot fully heal. Griffin remains incarcerated as of this recording, serving his 10-year sentence for homicide by reckless conduct. Lisa's family continues their advocacy for changes to sentencing laws in cold cases. Her son Jeremy has become a voice for other families dealing with unsolved murders, understanding personally the pain of waiting decades for answers. The case stands as a reminder that advances in forensic science continue to solve crimes that once seemed permanently unsolved. Genetic genealogy has emerged as a powerful tool, cracking cold cases across the country and bringing closure to families who thought they would never know the truth. Lisa's case contributed to the growing body of evidence that this technique works and deserves continued support and funding. For Lisa's family, the knowledge that her killer has been identified and convicted provides a form of closure, even if the sentence disappoints. They can finally visit her grave knowing who took her from them. They can honor her memory with the full story told. And they can work to ensure other families receive better outcomes when their decades-old cases finally get solved. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into cases that demand justice. Lisa Holstead's story reminds us why these cases matter, why we can't let time erase the obligation to pursue truth and accountability. Drop a comment. What cold case do you think deserves more attention? And share this video so Lisa's story reaches others who need to hear it. The science that caught Lou Griffin continues to evolve. More cold cases get solved every year through genetic genealogy and other advancing forensic techniques. Lisa's case proves that murderers can never truly rest easy, because the evidence they leave behind waits patiently for technology to reveal its secrets. Thank you for watching. And remember, justice may be delayed, but it should never be denied.